Hey guys, we're here today recording another tier list video, this time for the steel type Pokemon. If you guys enjoy the tier list videos, I know a lot of you guys do, leave a like below and subscribe. Shows me that you guys still want to see more of these. With that said though, also comment below. I want to see two things in the comments. More than anything of course, but any comment is appreciated. But one, does the audio sound better? I realized my mic was about 1.5 feet farther away than it needed to be, and I want to make sure that this sounds better. I thought it was just me talking too quiet. I realized it was a mic thing. The audio, I've checked it. It sounds a lot better on my end. What do you guys think? Two, comment what types you guys want to see below. With the typings, as far as the next tier lists go, we do have this one as well as the next two after it planned, because I do actually have to bulk record a bunch of these since I'm going on vacation till like around October 7th or 8th. So I need to get like a whole couple weeks worth of content done. So the next few tier lists are stuff I grabbed from your guys' comments already, such as the steel type tier list, but I want to see what else you guys want to see. With that said though, let's get into what the tierings are for anyone who might be new to these videos. Since I know that typically a lot of these views come from outside of my subscriber base, which also subscribe if you're interested, but basically, I do these tier lists on a combination of singles and doubles because that way then it's helpful to whoever finds it. The S+ is for Pokemon that are dominating tiers such as VGC, Natdex, Anything Goes, Sword and Shield Ubers. If it's a tier that allows Uber Pokemon basically, which would allow pretty much everything that we'd be tiering, then I'm going to count it, and it would need to be a top Pokemon in these formats, like a top 5, 10 Pokemon. The S range is for Pokemon that are still pretty viable in these formats, albeit you wouldn't see like a Zacian Crown in this range because it's defining the tier and it's not just a good Pokemon. You'd see more type of Pokemon such as Ho-Oh in this tier, or maybe Pokemon that really do define the OU tier, something like a Landorus Therian, for example. The A tiers for Pokemon that are still pretty good in OU, or they're very, very bad in Ubers, and they're only there because of some really niche complex thing, but ultimately they don't really deserve to be in the tier. And as far as other Pokemon you might see in the A range goes, these would be pretty kind of viable Pokemon in VGC, but they're not like any of the meta definers. This might be where you see something like a Ferrothorn, for example, which happens to be pretty good in VGC, but it doesn't define VGC. B tier is for Pokemon that are either pretty okay in OU, but they're not like great, or they're for Pokemon that are pretty good in UU. For the C tier, it's for Pokemon, and this is where we start to fade out of the doubles because there's no like doubles UU, RU. This is where you start to see Pokemon in like the RU, NU range. D is for NU, PU, and F is for Pokemon that are either unevolved and they're noteworthy enough to mention. This would be where you would see something like maybe a Mareanie, for example, which is better than a lot of low tier poisons, but it's not necessarily tiered. Or you'll see F tier Pokemon that are fully evolved because they're so bad, but they're at least noteworthy enough to mention. So with that said, let's start off our tier list with Alolan Sandslash. Now, as far as ice types go, this actually tiered pretty high on our list. It was a C tier Pokemon. And I think as far as Steel that goes, though, this ends up actually reaching the D tier. Steel's a lot more competition, in my personal opinion, as far as good Steel types go. And while I think it could maybe end up rising as the tier list goes on, for Steel's, Alolan Sandslash is a lot less impressive. It doesn't have the significantly less competition of other D tiers, such as when we were doing ice types. I think like Jinx was a D tier. The point being is the competition is a lot higher, and while it's still a Pokemon that did get banned from NU because of Fail, and because Hail was really good in Sword and Shield NU, and it is still a good Pokemon, mind you, I don't necessarily think this is a Pokemon that is like a really high RU performer, or even just a kind of viable RU performer. It just kind of exists because it was banned. And I do think that the Steel type tier list is a lot better indicative of this. Next up, Alolan Dugtrio, F tier, terrible Pokemon. This is really, really bad as far as ground types go, and as far as steel types go as well. One edge that this does have over a lot of steel types, though, is that it can actually handle other steel types, but we do have a few others, such as our next Pokemon, Magneton, that I do think are a little bit better at that job. Speaking of, next up, we do have Magneton. Now, Magneton is a pretty interesting one. This is still another like PU Pokemon, but I don't think it's outright unviable, like, for example, Alolan Dougie. The fact this is a steel type that can trap other steels and really put a lot of pressure on them, it has a really good counter matchup on a lot of them. And steel being as great of a typing as it is, I think this one has a good edge. It can actually put a lot of pressure on opposing steels as far as low tier go, because a lot of them are neutral to Thunderbolt. Albeit this would be, I guess, where something like Alolan Dugtrio, for example, would actually have a bit of a case, because it's a steel type that can't really actually get pressured by Magneton. But even still, I can't really see a lot of actually viable steels having to not worry about Magneton, so I do want to give it the D tier. Next up, though, we have Fortress. Fortress is a pretty interesting one. Really good hazard setter, really good spinner. It's pretty good as far as BDSP goes, albeit it's no meta definer, but it's a pretty decent Pokemon. I think I'm inclined to give this a I think I want to give it a C tier. As far as BDSP goes, it has been a while since I played the tier, to be fair, but I believe Fortress is it's a UU Pokemon, and it's a pretty good spiker. I've used this thing in OU actually, and it's been kind of not terrible, albeit it's a pretty niche Pokemon in OU because there's just a lot better hazard setters, because the format has a lot of hazard setters. But one thing this does have over a lot of them though is the dual hazard aspect, though actually never mind, because in BDSP they took away Stealth Rocks from this Pokemon, which was absurd. So Fortress does take a bit of a hit from that. Even still though, it is still a pretty good dual spiker because it does actually get Toxic Spikes and Spikes, which is still really good. Just not as good as it could have been with the triple spikes plus rapid spin set, or even just like a triple spike explosion, rocks plus spikes, a lot of other options that rocks do open up, so C tier. Next up, we do have Steelix. Steelix is a pretty interesting one, a really decent RU Pokemon in BDSP. It's a pretty good low tier Pokemon as far as Sword and Shield goes. This is one of those low tier steals that I think of, and I think this is like the defining low tier steal in my opinion. I'm gonna give this a really high C tier. I could maybe see this going to B in all honesty. Again, Steelix is one of those Pokemon that has RU in multiple gens, and on top of it as well, it's a pretty consistent RU-NU Pokemon. It always holds its ground, and it's one of those steals that, again, can actually pressure steals really well. In this case, it's through not just Earthquake, but also through Body Press with Iron Defense or Curse, which is really valuable in my opinion, so C tier. Mega Steelix, I'm literally going to put this right behind Steelix. I think that one edge that regular Steelix has that Mega Steelix does not have currently is Boots plus Sturdy is kind of valuable, at least as far as a Sword and Shield metagame perspective goes. I know that Steelix is obviously not having to compete with this Mega form in regular Sword and Shield, and they're both kind of inviolable in Nat decks, but I do think it's an important distinction to make because at least as far as a potential for Steelix to be used goes, Steelix does have that going for it as just another set it can run. Albeit, to be fair, Steelix is so bulky physically, it typically wouldn't really need to care about having to preserve Sturdy, but it is something that's going in its favor, and I do think that these are pretty even Pokemon. The defense and attack boosts that Mega Steelix gets honestly don't matter a ton, but they are still kind of important. As far as an ability goes, Sand Force is pretty garbage in this Pokemon, albeit low tier stands could benefit from it. But they're pretty equal in my personal opinion as far as viability goes. I think that though the deciding factor truthfully just comes from Boots. Regular Scizor gets a solid B tier actually. No, I'm gonna give this a solid A tier. This is a pretty defining Pokemon as far as BDSP OU goes. There's such a lack of steals that actually do well in that tier. Barring like Heatran and Scizor, I can't really tell you what actually viable steals exist in this tier. I know like Jirachi's kind of not bad, but the drop off is pretty big after Steelix and Heatran in my personal opinion. While you do have other options that are viable, these are the two steals that really do make the difference. Steelix is an amazing check to a lot of Pokemon such as Latios. It's a nice soft check to Pokemon, like really pretty much any Pokemon. It's great for stuff like Zam because it can actually offensively pressure you. It's great for stuff like, for example, Tangrowth because you can pivot on it really easily and you can recover on it really easily. And you don't really care about Leech, which at the very least something like a Skarmory would have to kind of be a little bit passive against, but you could always Toxic Stall back for what it's worth. The point is though, is you can not only switch in on these Pokemon, but you can also actually set up on them and put a lot of pressure. This is one of those steals that also does a lot of damage as far as offensive sets go, which a lot of steals besides Heatran don't really do. They're typically just defensive Pokemon in BDSP. So yeah, I gotta give it an A tier. This is a really good steal, and it's still pretty viable in Sword and Shield. Next up though, Mega Scizor. Mega Scizor is again a really good Pokemon, one of the better Megas in Nat Dex OU as far as I'm aware, albeit I do think that Mawile is a little bit more viable currently, but I know that the rating on Mega Scizor versus like Mega Mawile and other Steel type Megas does change a little bit. Currently it seems like it's a little bit below, but it is not a big jump. Like it's a 2 Pokemon difference, so Mega Scizor, though, is still one of the better steals as far as Nat Dex goes. It's an incredibly hard Pokemon to KO, even with hidden powers. And I know a lot of people, as far as, I did a lot of Draft League early Sword and Shield, and a lot of people I know were saying, oh my god, Mega Scizor without a hidden power metagame is going to be broken. It really didn't prove to be that broken, but Mega Scizor, even with hidden powers allowed, is still kind of obnoxious to kill, because hidden powers don't do a lot to it for most Pokemon. Maybe from like a Magnezone would make a difference, but not from a lot of Pokemon. Regardless though, this Pokemon is absurdly bulky, and it's really incredible to kill, well, incredibly hard to kill. It's got great momentum, it's got great hazard removal, it has great potential to be offensive. So, easy A tier in my opinion. Skarmory's up next, and I'm gonna give Skarmory B. It's not a bad Pokemon as far as BDSP goes, but the Scizor Heatran difference is pretty massive in my personal opinion. And as far as Sword and Shield goes, this is definitely like a solid UU Steel type. So I can't really justify putting us in the A tier, unlike something like a Scizor, which I know has the same sort of rating tierings. It's a UU Pokemon in Sword and Shield, and it is an OU Pokemon in BDSP. But I think the viability jump for Skarmory and Scizor is enough to mention as far as keeping Scizor in A tier and Skarmory in B. Still a really good spiker and still really good hazard removal, but I think that a couple things that do hurt this a bit are the ability to check Pokemon like special psychics in BDSP is a pretty big deal, because there aren't really a lot of dark types as far as BDSP goes. And if we were to actually look at the dark types that do exist in this tier anyway, it's really just T-Tar and Weavile, neither of which are super consistent switching stuff like Zam, for example, which gets Focus Blast. To be fair, with Weavile, you're not really switching on anything because it's such a frail Pokemon, and you can come in Revenge Sam, to be fair, especially with something I believe, no, Triple Axle isn't actually in this. You can't even Triple Axle it and try and break a Sash. You have to literally, if it's Sash Sam, you just have to sack. So I do think with that in mind that Skarmory does have a little bit of competition as far as a steel that can actually pressure BDSP Psychics go, but it's still not bad. Mawile, terrible Pokemon. It's at least not Alolan Dougie though. This has Intimidate, which is kind of good as far as a PU setting goes in Sword and Shield, but again, I don't even think this is a tiered steel type. If it is, it's not a great one. Yeah, it's not even tiered right now. I know there have been some metagames where it has been tiered, but the point is it's not good, but it at least is Intimidate, which is something. Also, Sheer Force is kind of cool. We see that from Tauros from time to time, but Mawile doesn't really have a lot of moves, especially that can take advantage of it to take advantage of the special or mixed Sheer Force sets. Though, for what it's worth, Fire Fang can still get boosted by this. You still have options like Crunch that get boosted, Iron Head that get boosted, so it has options to take advantage of this. But Mawile also has pretty terrible attack of 85, so F tier. Mega Mawile, on the other hand, A tier. I'm gonna put this above Mega Scizor. I do think that personally, the breaking aspect Mawile provides is pretty amazing as far as Mega Mawile goes. This has options like Sucker Punch for priority 2, so it can take advantage of the low speed, and Intimidate pre-Mega, as we see from stuff like Mega Ments in Ubers, is really valuable because this does give a lot of extra bulk to the Pokemon, allowing for stuff like easy setup turns, or even just a free substitute that you otherwise might not be granted. So I gotta give Mega Mawile a solid A tier. This is a really good steel type offensively speaking, and I do think that it deserves to be acknowledged as one. Aggron, terrible. I am gonna put this below Mawile because personally I've yet to actually find, well, no, because Aggron's at least tiered. I'm gonna put it above Mawile. They're both pretty bad in all honesty. I think that Aggron's probably one of the worst PU steals. Albeit, to be fair, Sturdy with Boots is kind of okay, and Rockhead with Head Smash is pretty, well, actually, Rockhead plus Head Smash sounds like it's really good in this current PU. I'll give it D tier. Rockhead plus Head Smash sounds pretty good on like a banded set. Also, again, Sturdy Boots, you can guarantee rocks up. Iron Defense plus Body Press, this is kind of like the low tier equivalent of that, because it does get Iron Defense. So I gotta give it that. I mean, Aggron actually, this is probably one of the better Aggron gens we've had in a while. Mega Aggron, on the other hand, this is an easy C tier. I'm going to put it above Steelix, though. Mega Aggron actually did get banned from Natdex AGRU. Well, Natdex RU, not Natdex AGRU. But Natdex RU did ban this Pokemon, actually, albeit it's still not an actually, like, U-tiered Pokemon, but it's still pretty good. Similar to Aggron, this is of options like Curse plus Body Press, and it can, as you've seen from Pokemon like Corviknight, for example, the setup in VizDef plus Body Press sets are insanely difficult to KO. And this Pokemon has such a high VizDef stat, on top of Filter as well, that makes this an absolute demonic Pokemon defensively speaking, and by the Iron Defense Body Press logic, also offensively speaking. Next up, Metagross. Metagross is a pretty solid Pokemon. I'm going to give this a B tier, and I'm going to put it above, well, no, I'm going to put it below Skarmory, because it's literally, it has the same sort of things that Scizor does offer to teams, but the issue being is that it's just worse at them. It's literally just outclassed by Scizor in every way. If you're the one exception that I will say though that Metagross does have that is a pretty unique thing over Scizor is the fact that it's also a rocker. But a lot of times you're running this as like a banded Pokemon or like an AV Pokemon to really make up for the extra bulk, since you actually do lack recovery on this, which is a pretty big deal. Something like a Skarmory, for example, would be able to out recover. Well, no, because I do want to keep in mind that this is actually kind of a demon in VGC with weakness policy sets. I'm gonna actually put this at bottom of A tier. This will literally be the lowest Pokemon we have in A tier, unless if I'm missing something. But one thing that I do think is pretty important is the fact this is a really good offensive weakness policy Pokemon that also doesn't really have to worry about Intimidators, which is a pretty nice niche this actually does carve out for itself as far as VGC goes, considering you're never gonna have to worry about Pokemon like Incineroar, and you can also creep them too and do a ton of damage to Incineroar. Like I'm talking Oko or near Oko range from Metagross. So I do think it's actually pretty valuable, and this is a really good Tailwind Pokemon as well, as far as being on Tailwind teams. So yeah, I'm going to give Metagross A tier, albeit this will probably be the lowest one in A tier. I cannot imagine a Pokemon being below it. Next up is Mega Metagross, easy S tier. This is a really good mon as far as Megas go. There's not really a lot of Megas that actually do compete with Mega Metagross as far as being initially offensive potent, because Metagross has some really good 4 attacks that it can run. Albeit, one thing I will say is that Metagross does have a couple issues as far as an Uber's metagame thing goes. For one, Metagross does have a lot of competition as far as steel types go, since Scizor is typically more sought after since it has actual recovery in the Uber setting. But even still, Metagross, again, just a lot more of an initially potent Pokemon. It's able to outpace stuff like Xerneas without having to worry about forcing to use priority, and you could still EV to actually take a hit after Geomancy, which is pretty cool. It's outpacing a lot of other box arts too, so you can have stuff like, for example, Earthquake for Pedon, you can have stuff like Rock Slide for Ho-Oh. You have a lot of options coverage-wise. Now, this isn't some uber viable Pokemon or anything, but it is viable enough to where I think it at least deserves an S tier. Registeel's up next. This gets a solid C tier. I'm going to put this right above Steelix. One thing that I do think that gives Registeel a bit of an edge as far as in RU Steel type, well, yeah, this is an RU Steel type, just had to double check that because I was thinking it might have been UU, is the fact this is able to, in my opinion, pull off Restock sets a bit better because it has a lot better of a mixed defense stat. And again, as I mentioned with Steelix, its defense is so high, it doesn't ultimately matter a ton if you invest or not. With Registeel, you do kind of have to invest to be fair, but you could still definitely get away with an Iron Defense Spidef set and still nailed a lot of teams with Body Press. 150 is still no laughing matter, and with the special defense being as high as it is, you also don't really have to worry about a lot of special Pokemon KOing you outright either. So I do think this is slightly better than Steelix, and Clear Body, again, another one of those things that's pretty valuable as far as weakness policy popping goes, but this isn't really some actually viable abuser of it in VGC. Typically that was actually Regirock that was popping weakness policy sets as far as VGC goes, and even then that was for a very short time, mind you. But Registeel's still pretty good, so I want to give it a C tier. Rachi's up next. This is definitely a decent A tier steel. Rachi does have a couple things going for it. For one, this is a pretty solid UU steel type as far as Sword and Shield goes. Similarly to Scizor, it just outclassed by a lot of Sword and Shield steals like Ferrothorn and Corviknight, etc. But this is a pretty good rocker. It's a pretty good pivot, great Wishmon. In BDSP as well, you'll see this is typically, again, another check to Pokemon like Zam and Latios. You can run some Team Desire U-turn sets, you can run Scarf sets. The one thing I will say that is pretty terrible for Rachi is it did lose out on Ironhead. Now, to be fair, if you are running this thing in BDSP, you do still actually have access to Zen Headbutt, which is pretty good, but unlike Ironhead, you do have a chance to miss, and your next best physical steel move as well is 90% accurate. As far as special sets go, this is a pretty good Calm Mind option. You really do have a lot of sets as far as BDSP Rachi goes. Albeit typically though, again, it's Spidef with U-turn and Doom Desire, and you can typically set this up to try and be similar to how Slowbro will pop Future Sight sometimes. Just a really annoying Spidef mon that's pretty hard to kill. So solid A tier. Empoleon, this is B tier, definitely B tier, below Skarmory for sure. It's a pretty cool rocker and defog option as far as UU goes. I've actually used this a lot this generation, and I think it's pretty good. Defiance also something that's a little bit okay, considering you have options like Sword Dance Jet, you have moves like, for example, Waterfall and Earthquake. Though sadly this doesn't really get Ironhead, which is really insane because this has literally like an iron anchor on its head. But who am I to judge? Regardless though, it's still pretty cool phaser, it's pretty cool with rocks. I do think it's a little bit of Forming Saw Syndrome, but otherwise it's a pretty good steal. Solid B tier. Bastiodon, terrible. This is actually probably gonna be our worst steal on the board for fully evolved ones. There's nothing I need to say about this mon. It's actually pretty unusable. This does not get Body Press, which would actually kind of save it, in all honesty, or give it an actual presence, offensively speaking. But the typing is still really terrible, even with Sturdy. And it also has a really low HP stat, despite having really high defenses. It's really slow, it has no recovery, it's just terrible. Terrible, terrible, terrible. It's just worse Aggron. Wormadam, trash, also F tier, but one thing I will give Wormadam trash is at the very least, if nothing else, this has Quiver Dance, which is something. It's at least something to kind of take advantage of its kind of usable offenses, but its speed is still so terrible. Actually, no, never mind. I can't actually rate this above Bastiodon, because Bastiodon at least has sturdy rocks. It can at least do one thing right. Mormonep cannot. Bronzong, this is a solid B tier. I'm actually going to put this above Skarmory. It's a pretty viable mon in VGC. It's a great Trick Room setter. It's a great mon as far as being a soft check to stuff like Xerneas, for example, albeit there's better options in Ubers, but it's not terrible, actually. It's pretty viable in a lot of different Uber settings, actually. It's typically a mon that's similar to something like a Quagsire. While this is like an RU Pokemon, you'll see it viable in a lot of tiers, and I think that's noteworthy enough as well. Obviously, it's probably a little bit more consistently viable in VGC than Metagross, but one thing that I do gotta give Metagross is I think the fact that Metagross, when it is viable, it's always like really absurdly viable, whereas Bronzong's always just kind of a decent Pokemon to use. And again, this is typically tiered lower in singles. It's typically never really in the higher tiers ever, but it is still kind of an okay Pokemon. So I do want to give this B tier. I think it's, again, a lot more consistently viable in Skarmory as far as the variety of formats it can provide for. So I do want to give it that distinction. Lucario, this is a solid B tier. It's a pretty viable steal as far as offensively speaking in BDSP goes. But at the same time, though, this is such an inviable Pokemon as far as Sword and Shield goes. So the jump is actually really fucking big. I believe this is a huge, no, it's an RU Pokemon. A little less than I thought, actually. I thought it was an NU steal. Regardless, though, I do think the jump is big enough, and this isn't really a Pokemon that has any doubles presence, unlike something like a Metagross or a Bronzong, for example. So I do want to tier it a bit lower than something like a Skarmory, which is still pretty viable in BDSP, and it's also, again, at least a little more viable in Sword and Shield. So I do want to make that distinction. Lucario is still a pretty offensively potent Pokemon, just not in the same vein that something like a Metagross or a Scizor are. Mega Lucario, easy S tier, better than Mega Metagross. This is an absolute demon as far as being an offensive Mega goes. Mega Lucario is slightly faster than Metagross. It has adaptability, which is a lot better than Tough Claws. You have insane offensive typing in fighting and steel, which is great for stuff like Xerneas, for example, which a lot of other fighting types do struggle to handle. You have amazing priority options with stuff like Vacuum Wave, Bullet Punch, and Extreme Speed. Both your offenses are really viable with physical and special attack, both breaking 140, with especially two amazing setup options in Nasty Plot and Sword Stance. I cannot imagine this Pokemon not being an S rank, in all honesty. I think there's a case for S+, but truthfully, I think with how much better the S+ steals are, I can't really justify giving it, sadly. Magnezone, it's solid A tier steal, actually. It's a really good trapper, and it's really good for anti-steals. I think this generation as well, blessing it with Body Press to give it some new life, as far as being a really good check to stuff like Ferrothorn, which it otherwise would have lacked with the cut of Hidden Power. So I do think that this generation was actually very kind to Magnezone as far as making it still keep up with a lot of things that it otherwise would have with the cut moves. Magnezone is a very terrifying Pokemon, though. This is one of those things that gets better the better the steel types are. It's a pretty good option in general with also offensive sets with stuff like Analytic Specs. So yeah, I wanna give this an A tier. It's a very solid steal. Probopass, I'm literally gonna put this at the top of F only because of the fact this also has Magnet Pull, but it is still so bad. One thing I will give Probopass though is again the fact that Probopass does also have options such as Sturdy, and you can run that with Sturdy Rocks. But sadly though, this isn't actually allowed in Sword and Shield, where it could have maybe done that and actually gotten boots to help with this. Albeit it still would have been terrible, but it would have been something. Actually, no, I don't think this gets Body Press. Yeah, it does not get Body Press. But it does, for what it's worth, unlike something like a Magnezone, it does still actually have a lot of coverage for steals. Stuff like Fire Punch and Earthquake, but it's also pretty weak offensively speaking. It still has the coverage at least, which is something. So I'll give it F tier, albeit it's still terrible. Dialga, easy S tier, but I'm going to put it below Mega Lucario, above Mega Metagross. It's a pretty cool anti-Ubermon, if that makes sense. It's a dragon that is neutral to dragons, which is pretty unique actually. Not a lot of them are, which is really useful in my personal opinion, as far as making sure you could take hits like Draco Meteor from a lot of the specs or Life Orb dragons, or maybe like a Bandit Outrage or something, because you could typically invest Dialga to take a single hit from these Pokemon and then Draco back and nuke the opposing Pokemon. So I do think that's pretty valuable. Dialga is also a pretty decent rocker. It has a lot of coverage actually. So I really couldn't give Dialga actually lower than an S tier. This is also a pretty viable Pokemon in the VGC metagames, albeit it was more viable as far as Series 12 goes than 13, because you could actually take advantage of weakness policy sets very well on Trick Room with Dynamax, but 13 is still not a terrible format for it. Just it's no longer really as valuable when you could just run something like a Groudon or like a Kyogre in tandem with like a Veltal, Cali, Shadow, and Zacian and throw on 2 random Pokemon. Still really good though, but just not as good as it used to be. Definite S tier in my opinion. Dialga Origin, this is literally, I think it's actually just a worse Dialga, and this is with a caveat though. This does assume that Dialga's Origin works the same way that Giratina's does. If it does not work the same way, this is objectively just a better Dialga, with no ifs, ands, or buts about it. However, if it is forced to run the Adamant Orb, again, similar to how Giratina's works, then this is objectively just a worse Dialga, because stuff like Leftovers, Resist Berries, Choice Specs, Assault Vest, you name it, are so valuable to Dialga's actual usage. It's not something like Giratina where there are some options that Giratina works better in for Origin versus alternate or altered. This is just worse in every sense of the manner. So I do still think it's an S tier steal, and it still has a lot of options going for it. Dialga has insane coverage and insane support moves to where you could still make a set work on this, but objectively speaking, it is just a worse Dialga. S tier. Heatran, easy S tier steal, albeit it will probably be the lowest one we see today. Heatran is one of the best OU Pokemon of all time, and it's honestly kind of approaching the same discussions as Landorus, albeit Landorus is a lot higher percentage, but it's consistently reaching like 25-30% in like every OU it's been in for the past several generations. It's able to adapt just like Landorus in a lot of offensive and defensive sets, and I'm actually kind of surprised it's not consistently in the same conversation as Landorus. There are even metagames where this is as viable or more viable than Landorus. So again, I can't really imagine a world where this is not an S tier steal, albeit the S tier steals above it are a lot better, but this is again in that same sort of topic of so oppressive that it needs to check itself, because typically Heatran, one of the better switch-ins to Heatran, well, to be fair, that unlike something like a Landorus, Landorus does have better checks than Landorus, but typically though, Heatrans are able to switch in on their fire moves and attack them with ground options and hope for the speed tie, just like a Landorus in Gen 7 was able to run Hidden Power Ice sets to beat other Landorus, or run Toxic this set to pressure other Landorus. So I do think this is, again, literally the same vein as Landorus, just it's less percentage because of Landorus. So S tier. Arceus Steel, definitely S tier, albeit I don't want to put it in S+. This does have the competition with a lot of other steals being so viable in Ubers, albeit this is still a very good one as far as steals go. As far as a viability goes, for other steals that do outclass it, I believe Ferrothorn actually outclasses it if I remember correctly. Duskmane obviously is a very easy one, Zacian Crown is a very easy one, but this is still a fairly viable option. It seems like Ferrothorn actually is finally out-tiered by it, which is kind of shocking because Ferrothorn typically was out-tiering Arceus Steel in a lot of Ubers because it's also a really good Kyogre switch-in, but I can kind of see it actually, this does make sense. Regardless though, Arceus Steel is still a very viable Pokemon as far as S2 steals go, but when we have options like Duskmane and Zacian, I cannot ever fathom putting this in the S+ range. Still solid S tier. Excadrill, this is honestly a B tier steal. Excadrill has fallen off a lot as far as just general usage goes, albeit this is still definitely a pretty potent UU steal. It's still really good as a Sand Sweeper, but Excadrill's use is definitely went down because of options like Corviknight and Celesteela being great checks to it, albeit it's still a really good bulky rapid spin option, it's still a really good Sand Sweeper, but you really do need to tailor your team right to actually make this work, unlike in past generations where Excadrill was the mindless Pokemon you threw on a team. It's still pretty good speed for Weather Sweepers, it's one of the fastest viable ones, in fact I think it actually is the fastest viable one. You get options like Rocks as well, it's pretty good with Mold Breaker to get past Magic Bounce Pokemon. Solid B tier. Escavalier, I'm going to give this one a low C. Escavalier is a pretty decent low tier steal. Solid in NU, you do have a lot of options like Assault Vest, Choice Band, Sword Stance, you name it. It's pretty decent. This is literally like the S tier equivalent of Scizor without recovery, momentum. Well, no, that was a bad example. It's literally nothing like Scizor actually. Regardless, still a really good bulky steal, really good low tier option. So I'm going to give this a C tier. Ferrothorn's up next. Top of that, this is literally like the best A tier steal we're going to get actually, spoiler alert. Really amazing Pokemon in VGC, really good Pokemon as far as viable in Ubers. It's a really good Pokemon as far as handling a lot of OU threats. This dual hazards, Leech is great recovery on this Pokemon because it has so few weaknesses. Great at Gyro Ball spamming, it's really good on Trick Room, it's really good at Anti-Trick Room. You name it, Ferrothorn does it. It's just below Heatran because I will say that unlike Heatran, Ferrothorn does have a little bit more competition as far as steal goes, and I think it's purely just because of the fact that I think that Heatran also has a lot better of a time doing offensive sets well, but Ferrothorn is still really amazing, and I think, again, If Hedron is the definitive lowest S tier, I think Ferrothorn then, by that logic, has to be the definitive highest A tier. I think the gap is a little bit, it's very slim, but I do think it's noticeable enough to where they do need a gap, in my personal opinion. That's when I do honestly expect could end up becoming an S tier steal come Scarlet and Violet, but right now it is not there. Kling Klang, definitely a D tier steal. I think that for what it's worth, Kling Klang, while it's not great, this is a pretty decent, like, low-ish tier steal. Shift Gear is pretty cool on it, and you have stuff like Gear Grind, which is good at breaking sashes, albeit it has a pretty low accuracy count. Actually, no, the accuracy count is pretty bad. I'm gonna put this in F, below Probopass. Still pretty cool Shift Gear option, in all honesty. It has some pretty good natural bulk to it, so we'll give it F tier. Stunfisk Galar, forgot this existed. This is the lowest steal. This mon is fucking terrible. Really missed potential. Stunfisk Galar, it pains me because at least a low in Dugtrio, it's a ground steal, it's fast. But it's also, if it changes ground typing, I think it could have actually had some merit because you could maybe change it to like a steel psychic in low tiers for psychic terrain, and that could have been really good. Or grass steal and made it just a budget Ferrothorn, but it does none of that. It changes its steel typing, which is a lot worse for the ability. So easy F tier. Easy F tier. Bishop's a pretty good offensive steal. It has a lot of good usage in OU as far as like the mon itself goes. It's great at revenging offensive psychics. Defiance really good for anti-defog. I do think, however, this is a B tier steal actually. And it's typically just because of how inconsistently it actually is a viable steal in OU. Basically, Bisharp is like Volcarona, where it'll either be one of the better Pokemon you can use, or it's one of the worst ones you can use. It's still typically like bubbling in and out of OU, but it's never really like a consistently top tier Pokemon. And I think that we have a lot of other steals that are at least pretty fairly good at their metagames. The closest example I could think of is Metagross to this. However, I think the difference being is that Metagross also has a doubles presence, and it's still fairly viable in a lot of other tiers, albeit maybe not OU consistently like Bisharp is in and out of OU, but it still is fairly viable. So I'm gonna give Bisharp B tier. This will probably be one of our higher B tier steals in my opinion. Durant's up next. Durant had a pretty crazy early VGC presence. However, ever since Ubers got introduced, it's been pretty unviable. It's still a cool low tier option. I'm going to give this thing a solid B. I'm going to put it below Lucario though. The one reason being is I think the fact that, actually, no, I'm going to give this above Lucario, actually below Empoleon. Because if nothing else, this is a doubles presence that was pretty good. Lucario, I think, had a short stint in doubles in like one Dynamax metagame. Even still, though, it was a lot more niche than Durant was, because Durant was actually like running tournaments pretty well. Lucario, I think I saw like once in the ladder. Regardless, though, B tier. Cobalion, C tier. I think this is just a worse version of Lucario. I'm gonna put it below Steelix personally. Cobalion's not terrible. Say what you want about Cobalion being UU. I think that if nothing else, a lot of actually. No, I'm gonna put this above the Aggron's at least. I do think it's still worse than Lucario because if nothing else, stuff like Lucario had a pretty good presence in BDSP OU. Durant had a pretty good presence in VGC early metas, and Empoleon still is a pretty good niche Pokemon in other OUs. Cobalion is outright unviable as far as an OU standing goes, but it's a pretty okay option in UU, so I'm gonna give it C tier. Genesect, really good mon actually. I've come around on this Pokemon a lot. Genesect was a Pokemon I used to think was like really bad in Ubers, but it's a pretty decent Scarfer, albeit it's still not amazing, but it's a pretty cool option in a lot of niche cases. It's able to tie options like Xerneas, which is pretty useful. Shift Gear is pretty cool in some very niche cases. It has a lot of good coverage, physical and specially. Easy S tier. Deblade, I put this on here because this used to be a pretty viable steal, albeit I still personally think it's a lot more viable than a lot of the F tiers, albeit maybe its tiering doesn't really justify that, but it is still a PU steal, which is something that a lot of these Pokemon cannot really say. It has some pretty good Swords Dance options. It's a Violate, really physically, defensively bulky, easy D tier in my opinion. Aegislash, this has come around a lot actually. Aegislash used to be one of these like S tier Ubers, and now it's fallen and fallen and fallen. I'm gonna put it below Excadrill. Pretty cool option as far as a more niche steal in VGC, but actually Bronzong's a little more viable than it in that. Well, no, because it's a lot more viable in singles than Bronzong. But if nothing else though, there's a little bit of difference, at least between using something like a Bronzong and a Aegislash. But Aegislash is pretty cool for a few reasons though. It's pretty good with Iron Ball to take out options like Xerneas, for example, and I've run the calcs myself. I do know for a fact this does do it, unless Xerneas is Dynamaxed. On top of that as well, Aegislash is also a pretty good Trick Room user in VGC. It's pretty cool at just being a nice weakness policy Dynamax Pokemon. But again, with a lot of other Ubers with Dynamaxing, it's become a lot less viable in later seasons. It's still a really cool option though. Easy B tier in my opinion. Sliggoo, I tiered this on here because I don't think it's the worst F tier steel. It's a steel type that is more recent that gets toxic because of Gumi getting toxic. Still not great though. I'm gonna put it at least below. I'm gonna put it above Mawile because Dragon Steel is a pretty cool typing and it has some good options for it at least. And it's also a good Violate mon, if nothing else, considering purely its typing alone and the fact that it has pretty okay bulk with Violet, like 83 and 113 respectively, on top of a 58 HP stat, is pretty not terrible for low tiers. I can't imagine this won't be a PU Pokemon. It will still probably be PU, but I can't imagine it won't at least be tiered. So F tier. I don't want to be too ambitious with it though, because it is still pretty bad. And I think there are some metagames where maybe these two could actually be tiered Pokemon, but still F tier. Hisuian and Goodra, I think this will actually be a pretty good steel type. As far as where I think it will tier, I'm kind of thinking this will be below Skarmory. Yeah, I think below Skarmory, above Empoleon. Hisuian and Goodra does have a lot going for it. For one, it's a really bulky Pokemon, and unlike Goodra, it does have a lot better defense, being base 100 defense. It did trade out some of its speed for this, to be fair, but I don't think it really matters when the typing is so good. Has a plethora of coverage options. It has some okay setup with Curse too, which could actually be pulled off on a 100 physical attack Pokemon. And it could be really good, especially now that Goodra's a bit slower. It could be useful in maybe Trick Room builds. I don't know how viable this will be necessarily, but it's something I think that could be pretty good. I think it'll be something we'll have to wait and see, but the typing is pretty decent offensively. We see from stuff like Dialga, this is a pretty potent typing. If this just gets Stealth Rocks, I think that Stealth Rocks would actually push this into the A tier territory because it would basically just be a budget Dialga, but we'll have to see. Jury's still out on that one. Klefki, solid B tier steel. I'm going to put this right above Empoleon. As far as Klefki goes, it's a really solid UU Pokemon. Well, RU Pokemon, actually. I thought it was UU. Really solid RU Pokemon, but it's also one of those things like Bronzong where it's fairly viable as far as upper tiers go. It's a great Screen Setter in Ubers. It's a great Spiker in Ubers. There are occasional metagames as well in UU and RU where this is a pretty viable, on a UU and OU where it's pretty viable. I gotta give it its justice. This is a B tier steel. Silvally Steel, as far as Silvally forms go, is one of the better ones. I would definitely not be putting this in F tier, which I know I've put a lot of the recent Silvally forms in, because Silvally Steel is actually a pretty decent one. As far as low tier steels go, it's pretty well balanced bulk wise. I'm going to put it above Escav. I think this is a pretty solid steel. In fact, no, I'm definitely going to put it above Escav, below Fortress, because Fortress is pretty viable as far as like higher than any formats go. But Parting Shot plus a lot of the mixed coverage it gets is pretty solid. C tier. Togedemaru literally only gets tiered at all because of the fact that it's actually like a kind of niche thing in VGC and it's actually tiered. It's probably going to be one of the worst options we get, but it does get a couple things going for it. For example, Spiky Shield's pretty good. It has options like Wish, which is actually kind of good, especially with Momentum. Zing Zap's another way for it to flinch shit. So yeah, I think this is a solid D tier steel. Solgaleo, literally right above Dialga, because this is an actual Xerneas Resist. It's an actual another Pokemon similar to Dialga. Well, similar to Metagross actually, that doesn't worry about Intimidate, so it's able to just do Dialga's job in both singles and doubles, just better than it. The one thing it doesn't have though, which is actually pretty big as far as singles goes, is it lacks Stealth Rocks, which is pretty terrible for it. So that's really why they're so close. Otherwise, Solgaleo would probably honestly have competition for an S plus spot, but it would still probably be S in all honesty, because Dusk may just have classes that much. Regardless though, it's still an S tier steel. Celesteela, this is a solid A tier steel, albeit it's one of the, I'm actually going to put this below Metagross. I know I said Metagross is going to be lowest, but I forgot about Celesteela. It's a UU steel currently, but it's still pretty viable in OU with stuff like Meteor Beam and Autotomize being not bad. It's still some pretty nice bulk, just Corviknight's typically outclassing it right now. It's still a pretty cool option in VGC because it is a little bit hard to kill, and it's like a Spikemuth Cup. It's a pretty not bad check to stuff like Kartana and Rillaboom. So I'm going to give it an A tier. Kartana is a really good steal. Offensively speaking, this is an incredible monster. This is piped up a lot this generation because it's a really good scar for a really good SD mon. In Nat decks, you can pop Z movesets on it, obviously. I'm going to give it an A tier. I think that at the very least, it's not as meta-defining as these four as far as OU goes, but it is still a pretty impressive steel type. First, S plus steel. Honestly, this might... No, I can't put it above Zacian Crown. I was gonna say it might be above Zacian Crown. They're pretty similar though. I think the competition, I know a lot of people will say that Zacian Crown is like the best Pokemon of all time. I think the gap is a lot smaller, though, between Zacian Crown and Duskmane than a lot of people give it credit for. This is an incredible defensive behemoth. It's also got a lot of really strong offensive sets with stuff like Dragon Dance, Autotomized Sword Stance, gets great recovery that Zacian Crown misses out on. It's able to actually check Zacian Crown, which Zacian Crown needs to force speed ties with. This is a pretty good check in general to it, though. And it also checks a lot of other top tier stuff like Xerneas, for example. So this is an easy S+, by far one of the easiest S pluses we've ever done. Magearna, on the other hand, this is a solid S tier. I'm going to put it right above Solgaleo. Actually, no, right above Solgaleo, actually, because this is a little bit more of a demon as far as Trick Room teams go in VGC. Solar has been pretty destructive as far as VGC goes because it's able to take advantage of everything dying in the field, both your partner Pokemon and also 2 of the opponent's Pokemon. So it can snowball teams pretty quickly as far as Trick Room teams go. It's pretty good with Weakness Policy and Dynamax. As far as singles goes in Ubers, it's still an okay option to check Xerneas, albeit without Heart Swap, it's definitely worse at the job. Natdex is still pretty okay. But Xerneas isn't running the tier as much anymore, though Heart Swap is still pretty good for a lot of the other Dynamax options in Natdex AG, so solid S tier. Again, Magearna's fallen off a bit, but still pretty good. We have Sack Attack up next, and Sack Attack is a pretty good option. Similar to Bronzong, it's able to be viable in a lot of other things like doubles, for example. Though I am going to actually put it below Bronzong. I'm going to put it above Empoleon, above Fusu and Guja. I still think that below Skarmory is a pretty big thing because it is a lot less viable in Bronzong and singles, considering Stack Attack is an NU tier Pokemon. But stuff like Body Press is able to actually be pretty solid, especially if you boost defense instead of offense, and your opponent does have to kind of play that mind game. It also has a lot of other moves like Heat Crash, which is great for steals, like Ferrothorn. You can run stuff like Earthquake, which is great more generally speaking for steals. Gyro Ball is great for Xerneas. You have a lot of options to go with Stack Attack. So I do think it's actually a solid B tier, especially because unlike a lot of other steals, barring something like a Bronzong, well, let me rephrase, barring like an Aegislash, which is also tiered slightly above, this can set its own Trick Room, which is pretty good. So I think it at least holds the same tiering discussion. Meltan, it's tiered here because it's not a little cut Pokemon, but this is definitely the worst steal we're gonna get. One thing that does benefit this is the fact that it does have Magnet Pull, which is kind of cool. But its moveset options are so terrible. You're basically trying to rely on status, which Toxic doesn't work on steals, and you basically have to Thunderbolt them down. Kind of cool for Corviknight and Skarmory, I guess, but your special attack is still only 55. You're not getting anywhere. F tier. Melmo, this is a solid A tier steal. Actually, I'm gonna put it above regular Scizor, below Mega Scizor. Purely for the fact that I know this is an Uber Pokemon. Actually, no, this did get lowered. I swear I thought it was an Uber Pokemon, but it got lowered. Huh. Well, I still think it's a pretty viable Pokemon as far as Sword and Shield OU goes. This is an absolute monster right now, actually, in the tier. If we were to take a look at the Natdex Anything Goes viability, I'm pretty sure this sits in like the A. Yeah, it's an A-, and I'm pretty sure it's like an S Pokemon right now, or it's an A+ Pokemon as far as Sword and Shield OU goes. It's one of those really top tier. Yeah, it's an S-. It's one of those really top tier Pokemon though that is able to check a lot of things just blanket because of its natural physical bulk, and you can throw an AV on it or a Choice Band on it, and it's a pretty massive demon. It's a pretty cool Pokemon in VGC, albeit it's not as cool as Magearna is, but it's still pretty nice. It's a solid A tier. Melmetal G-Max, I'm gonna put this literally just right tied with Melmetal. Torment's pretty cool on it, but at the same time though, Melmetal's typically not your best G-Max option. Still pretty cool though. It does make Melmetal a bit harder to KO because you typically would be attacking it with a super effective move, and its bulk is so amazing with Dynamax that you can then take it so they need to take multiple extra turns to kill you by going from the max steal, whatever the G-Max move is. So it's a solid A tier. Corviknight, A tier Pokemon. I'm gonna put it right above Kartana because unlike something like a Scizor or a Mega Scizor, it's not as top tier, but it still is a pretty good option as far as OU steals go. It's an A- in OU. It's still kind of viable in Ubers, but not like really viable in Ubers. It's B-, it's a B+ in Natdex, still pretty viable. Iron Defense sets with Body Press are good. Defog sets are good. It's not a bad Pokemon. It's just not great. G-Max Corviknight, this gets a solid B tier. I'm going to put it at actually the bottom of B tier because for one, Corviknight doesn't necessarily care as much about the fact that it can't Airstream, but it still is a pretty big detriment considering the fact you do miss out on stuff like, for example, whatever the thing is that's boosted based off your stats. I know Corviknight gets the move, same thing that Crook gets. I'm spacing on the move though. The point is that Corviknight, I know it does, I gotta actually look at the move because I sound stupid right now. It's not Payback, it's not Assurance, it's not Thief. Oh my god, what is the fucking move? I know it's a dark type move, And it's, oh, I sound really stupid now. Power Trip, it gets Power Trip. I know it gets that, and Airstream would help a little bit with Power Trip sets, but at the same time, though, it still can boost stuff with Steel Spike and Knuckle and make the sets pretty terrifying, and it still gets agility of its own. It's just a lot more setup you're relying on. But Corviknight typically, for a G-Max set, would have a lot of 4 moveset syndrome. It's still a solid option. It's still really bulky and still incredibly hard to kill. B tier. Well, yeah, B tier. Berserker, pretty terrible, but at the same time, though, Berserker at least is a tiered Pokemon, and Steely Spirit's kind of cool. Same as Battle Armor and Tough Claws. It has 3 really good abilities and such a terrible stat line. I'm gonna put it above Togedemaru, Deblade, and Aggron. Actually, I'm gonna put it below Magneton though, because Magneton I think has a lot more uniqueness to it, whereas Deblade is competing with stuff like Aggron, Togedemaru, and Deblade, all for like that PU range sort of steel type. They can put on an offensive presence, kind of. E tier. Copper Jaw. Copper Jaw is pretty cool actually. This is a solid NU steel. Sheer Force is pretty amazing on it. Heavy Metal is also really good. I'm gonna put this above. I'm gonna put it above Fortress. It's one of those Pokemon that also kind of has some good like RU viability, but like not super. Good rocker, good AVMon. It does a lot. Easy C tier in my opinion. Raj G-Max, this actually is a pretty viable one. I'm going to put it right above Corv. I think the Steel Spike is actually really good, but it's also a lot worse for Pokemon you're running. So there's a give and take that Corv is a lot better for Pokemon naturally, but Raj is a lot better of a max move. Steel Spike is such an extra hazard to get, but it is pretty good on some Pokemon. So I'm going to give it B tier. They're both pretty equal. Raj also has a lot of other really good max moves, stuff like Max Knuckle, Max Flare, Max Overgrowth, Max, really it gets basically everything. Duraludon. Duraludon's kind of okay. Again, another one of those like lower tier Pokemon. I was banned from PU at least, but it's still not great. I'm gonna put it again like in the. No, never mind. I got the tiering wrong. Yeah, I'm gonna put it like right above Magneton, below Sandslash, because at least it was banned from PU, which is something. The G-Max form literally can just stay right here. Actually, no, because Duraludon was kind of viable in VGC. I'm gonna give it C tier, because Duraludon was at least kind of viable in VGC. I'm going to put the G-Max literally right above it, because most people were running the G-Max, to be fair, versus the D-Max, because, well, no, most people were running, I mixed it up, most people were running the Dynamax because it got Steel Spike, and you could boost defenses a lot easier. You can't do that with, the Max, no, I think its Max move is, well, it's still missing out on Worm, which is still actually pretty good as far as taking hits defensively. The Spike doesn't really matter in VGC, games are so short that it really does not make a difference. I'm actually going to put this in D tier, I'm going to put it below Slash. Next up, I'm going to do Zama Crown first because it's a lot more interesting of a discussion, but I've come around on this Pokemon a lot. I'm going to put it above Genesect, and I think it's for the sole reason that on ladder, this has actually been becoming a pretty good blanket check to a lot of things. It's a Pokemon that's pretty hard to KO, and you can typically take advantage of this as just a general check all mon, specifically for physical attackers, which is kind of cool. I'll be honest, I couldn't tell you specifically what it's like really being used to check. I know it's like a good Kyurem check, but Kyurem's also been so inviolable since this thing became a lot more used. And even still, I wouldn't say that Zama Crown is like obnoxiously viable, but it's, you know what it is? It's a Weavile check. That's what it is. It's being a good Weavile check, which is a pretty good one, to be fair. Regardless though, it's a good general like physical wall for a lot of things, same as like G-Darm, but it's a solid S tier. I used to hate this Pokemon. I used to think it was terrible, but Meta's favored a lot more recently, so S tier. S+, best Pokemon of all time. I think that, again, the discussion's pretty similar between this and Duskmane, but it's also a lot more of a discussion now. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. If you did, leave a like below and subscribe for more content. Next week's tier list is going to be grass types, I believe. If not, it's bug. One of them is next week, the other one's the week after. So make sure you guys stay subscribed for those and comment what tier list you want to see after those two. With that said, I'll see you guys later. Until then, peace out, guys.